June 1944. The beaches of Normandy are finally secure. The largest invasion in human history has succeeded. But now, just miles inland, the entire Allied advance has ground to a complete halt. Not because of enemy fire, not because of lack of supplies, but because of dirt. Ancient dirt walls covered in brush and trees that had divided French farmland for 1,000 years. American tanks, the most advanced war machines on Earth, are being destroyed one after another. Their crews are dying. Generals are panicking. The entire invasion, everything thousands of soldiers died for on D-Day, is on the verge of complete failure. And then a 29-year-old sergeant from New Jersey, a man with no engineering degree, no formal training, walks up to a pile of German scrap metal with a welding torch and a crazy idea. What he built in the next 48 hours would save the invasion, revolutionize tank warfare, and earn him a personal commendation from President Eisenhower. But it almost didn't happen, because everyone thought he was absolutely insane. This is the story of Curtis Culin, the mad mechanic who turned broken German defenses into the weapon that broke the Nazi grip on France. Let me take you back to exactly why the Allied armies were stuck. When planners designed the D-Day invasion, they studied every detail of the Normandy beaches. They knew about the concrete bunkers, the machine gun positions, the minefields, the beach obstacles. They prepared for all of it with specialized equipment, naval bombardment, airborne troops. They had a plan for everything, except they completely missed the hedgerows. Now, if you've never seen the Norman bocage, let me paint you a picture. Imagine you're standing in what looks like a beautiful patchwork of small fields. But each field is surrounded not by a fence, but by a massive earthen wall. These walls, called hedgerows, had been built up over centuries. Farmers would clear rocks from their fields and pile them at the edges. Dirt would accumulate. Trees and bushes would grow, year after year, generation after generation, for over 1,000 years. By 1944, these hedgerows were anywhere from 3 to 15 feet tall. They were 6 to 8 feet thick at the base. The earthen banks were dense as concrete, reinforced with centuries of tangled roots. And on top, there was a thick mass of trees, bushes, brambles, all woven together into an impenetrable wall. The fields they surrounded were tiny, maybe 50 to 200 yards across. And the only way between them were these ancient sunken lanes, roads that had been worn down over centuries until they sat below ground level, with hedgerows towering on both sides like canyon walls. The American soldiers called it Hell's Maze. When the Allied tanks first encountered these hedgerows, they tried the obvious solution. Drive through them! Except these tanks weighed 30 tons and had 400 horsepower engines. They could crush cars, knock down buildings, ford rivers, but they couldn't punch through a hedgerow, so they tried going over them. And this is where the nightmare really began. Picture a Sherman tank, the workhorse of the American Army. It's got 5 inches of armor on the front. That's good protection against almost anything the Germans can throw at it. But underneath, the belly of the tank has less than an inch of armor. It's the Achilles heel. When a Sherman tried to climb over a hedgerow, here's what happened. The tank would tilt upward as the treads grabbed the earthen bank. Up, up, up it would climb, exposing that thin belly armor. The tank's gun, mounted in the turret, would be pointing uselessly at the sky. The driver couldn't see where he was going. The tank would reach the top, teeter for a moment, completely helpless. And that's when the Germans would fire. See? The Germans had figured this out immediately. They'd set up their defenses specifically to take advantage of it. They'd position a Panzerschreck team, that's a German anti-tank rocket launcher, with a perfect view of each hedgerow crossing point. They'd wait for the tank to expose its belly. One rocket, straight into the thin bottom armor, and the tank would brew up, as they said. Brew up meant the ammunition inside would cook off, the fuel would ignite, and the whole thing would become a metal coffin for the 5 men inside. Even if the tank made it over without getting hit, the Germans had another advantage. These tiny fields meant a tank could only see maybe 50 yards in any direction. German soldiers could hide anywhere. A single German with a Panzerfaust, a disposable anti-tank weapon, could wait in the next hedgerow, let a tank pass, then hit it from behind where the armor was even thinner. Tank crews started calling the hedgerows the Green Hell. For good reason. The American commanders tried everything they could think of. They used explosives to blow gaps in the hedgerows, but they didn't have nearly enough explosives for the thousands of hedgerows between them and their objectives. Plus, every time they set off an explosion, German artillery would rain down on that position. The explosions told the enemy exactly where to aim. They tried having combat engineers dig through the hedgerows. Too slow. A team of engineers with picks and shovels could spend hours on a single gap. Meanwhile, the Germans had all day to set up defenses and call in reinforcements. They had a few tanks equipped with bulldozer blades. But there were only 4 dozer tanks per battalion. That's 4 tanks out of 70. And the dozer tanks were incredibly obvious. They were loud, slow, and the Germans learned to target them immediately. Knock out the dozer tanks first, and the entire battalion was stuck. The American advance, which had powered across the beaches with such momentum, slowed to a crawl. Units that should have captured objectives miles away were still fighting for the same fields they'd been in days earlier. Casualties were mounting. Sherman tanks, which had cost American factories months of work and American taxpayers millions of dollars, were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. And here's the thing that was driving the generals crazy. They had complete air superiority. They had more tanks than the Germans. They had more men, more supplies, more of everything. But none of it mattered, because they couldn't advance through these ancient dirt walls. General Omar Bradley, the commander of all American ground forces in Normandy, was starting to panic. The entire plan for the invasion depended on rapid movement inland. They needed to capture the port cities. They needed to give the Germans no time to reinforce. Every day stuck in the hedgerows was a day the Germans could bring up more troops, more tanks, more artillery. Bradley would later write that the bocage was the most serious tactical problem his army faced in the entire European campaign. More serious than the German fortifications on the Atlantic Wall. More serious than the Siegfried Line. Ancient French farmland was doing what Hitler's vaunted defenses couldn't, stopping the American army cold. Officers were holding meetings, trying to come up with solutions. Tank crews were getting desperate, trying modifications on their own initiative. One unit tried mounting a set of hollow pipes on the front of a tank. They'd ram the pipes into the hedgerow. Then combat engineers would stuff them with explosives and blow a hole. It sort of worked, but it was slow, dangerous, and they kept running out of explosives. Another tank crew suggested using a pair of timber poles like giant forks to stab through the base of the hedgerows. They called it the salad fork. It didn't work. The wood broke, and even when it didn't, the tank still exposed its belly going over the top. The Germans, meanwhile, were thrilled. They'd been expecting to get pushed back quickly once the Allies got off the beaches. Instead, they'd been handed a perfect defensive position. Small units of German troops were tying down entire American divisions. Every hedgerow was a fort. Every field was a trap. The clock was ticking. The invasion was stalling. And nobody had a solution. That's when Curtis Culin started paying attention to a crazy conversation. Curtis Grubb. Culin III was not the guy you'd pick to save an invasion. He was 29 years old, born and raised in Cranford, New Jersey. Before the war, he'd been a regular working guy. No college degree, no engineering background. He wasn't a West Point graduate or a brilliant scientist. He was a National Guardsman, a citizen soldier who'd been called up when America entered the war. Culin was a sergeant in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, part of the 2nd Armored Division, the Essex Troop, they called it. His job was to drive and maintain a light tank, an M5 Stuart. It was smaller and faster than a Sherman, used for scouting ahead of the main force, which meant Culin had seen the hedgerow problem up close. His unit had been trying to navigate the bocage for weeks. They'd lost tanks. They'd lost friends. And like everyone else, they'd been sitting around trying to figure out how to solve it. One day, in late June or early July of 1944, the exact date is lost to history, Culin's unit was having one of these bull sessions. Tank crews sitting around, exhausted, frustrated, throwing out ideas. Most of them were jokes. Dark humor was how soldiers coped. And then somebody, a soldier from Tennessee, according to some accounts, maybe named Roberts, said something. "Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges?" The other soldiers laughed. Saw teeth? Like you're going to cut through a 1,000-year-old earthen wall reinforced with rocks and roots, like you're cutting wood. Hilarious. Good joke. Next. But Curtis Culin didn't laugh. He sat there, and he thought about it. And the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. See, here's what Culin understood that the others didn't. The problem wasn't the hedgerow itself. Dirt and roots, no matter how compacted, would eventually give way to enough force. The real problem was that when a tank tried to go over the top, it became helpless. But what if you could cut into the base of the hedgerow instead? What if you could slice through the bottom while keeping the tank level? The tank would still have its treads on the ground. The gun could stay aimed forward. The thin belly armor would never get exposed. You wouldn't be climbing over the wall. You'd be plowing through it at ground level. It would work like a knife cutting through butter. No, not butter. Like a plow cutting through soil. No, not quite that either. Like tusks. Like a rhinoceros charging through brush. Culin started sketching ideas. He was a tank driver, so he understood the mechanics. He knew where you could weld attachments to the front of a tank without interfering with the treads or the gun. He knew how much force a 30-ton tank could deliver through its front armor. He knew the angles, the stress points. What he needed was metal, strong metal, shaped into prongs that could pierce and rip through the earthen banks. Something that could withstand the impact of hitting a hedgerow at speed, over and over again. And then he remembered the beaches. When the Germans were preparing to defend against the D-Day invasion, they'd placed thousands of obstacles on the beaches. Concrete pyramids, mines on posts, and these things called Czech hedgehogs, big X-shaped crosses made of steel beams welded together. They were designed to stop landing craft and tanks from getting off the beach. The invasion had blasted right past them. Many were destroyed, but many more were still sitting there on the sand, no longer needed. Just scrap metal now, except it wasn't scrap. It was high-grade steel, thick and strong, and there were tons of it, literally, just sitting there waiting to be cleared away. Culin got permission from his company commander to take a team back to the beach and collect some of this steel. His commander probably thought it was a long shot, but at this point, they were willing to try anything. Culin and his crew loaded up a truck with Czech hedgehog segments. These were thick steel beams, each one maybe 6 feet long, heavy enough that it took 2 men to lift one. They brought them back to the unit's maintenance area, and then Culin got to work. He cut the steel beams into sections. He shaped them into 4 heavy prongs, like the tines of a fork, but massive. Each prong was 3 to 4 feet long, angled slightly upward. He welded them to a crossbar that could be bolted to the front of a tank. The idea was simple. The prongs would hit the base of the hedgerow first. They'd stab into the earth and roots. Then, as the tank's treads kept driving forward, the prongs would act like giant knives, cutting through the bottom of the hedgerow. The force of 30 tons moving at speed would rip the whole thing open. The tank would burst through at ground level, never exposing its belly, never tilting up helplessly. Culin called his contraption a hedgerow cutter. Others would later call it the Culin Device. But the name that stuck was the one the tank crews came up with, the Rhino. Because when you mounted those steel prongs on the front of a tank, It looked like a rhinoceros ready to charge. Now came the test. They bolted Culin's device to the front of his M5 Stuart light tank. The tank looked ridiculous. These four massive steel tusks jutting out from the front armor, like some kind of medieval battering ram. Nobody was sure it would work. Plenty of people thought it would just break off the moment it hit a hedgerow. Or worse, the impact would damage the tank itself. Culin climbed into the driver's seat, his crew buttoned up. They drove toward the nearest hedgerow, one that had been giving them trouble for days. A crowd of soldiers gathered to watch. Some were curious. Some were skeptical. Some were just bored and wanted to see something break. Culin lined up the tank, gunned the engine, and charged. The steel prongs hit the hedgerow with a tremendous crash. The tank shuddered. For a moment, it seemed like the hedgerow was going to stop it, like every other attempt. And then the hedgerow exploded. The prongs ripped through the earthen bank like it was made of cardboard. Dirt and roots and brush went flying. The tank plowed straight through, never tilting, never slowing. In seconds, Culin's tank burst out the other side into the next field. The crowd erupted in cheers. They'd done it. The answer had been right there the whole time, sitting in scrap metal on the beach. And all it took was one sergeant who was willing to listen to a crazy idea and actually try it. But Culin knew this was just the first step. One tank with a hedgerow cutter was interesting, but there were thousands of Allied tanks in Normandy and thousands of hedgerows between them and Germany. If this was going to make a difference, they needed to scale it up fast, and for that, Culin needed to convince someone with stars on their shoulders. Word of Culin's successful test spread quickly through the 2nd Armored Division. Officers started coming to watch demonstrations. More tanks were fitted with the device, and every single one of them worked perfectly. They could punch through hedgerows in seconds, again and again, without exposing themselves to enemy fire. The reports made their way up the chain of command, all the way up to General Omar Bradley himself. Bradley was the man under the most pressure in Normandy. The success or failure of the entire invasion rested on his shoulders. He'd been desperately searching for a solution to the hedgerow problem. He'd had engineers working on it. He'd had think tanks analyzing it. Nothing had worked. So when he heard about a sergeant from New Jersey with a welded contraption made from German scrap metal, Bradley did something a lot of generals wouldn't have done. He went to see it for himself. The demonstration for General Bradley took place in mid-July 1944. The exact location isn't recorded, but it was somewhere in the Norman countryside. Behind the front lines, but close enough that you could still hear artillery fire in the distance. Curtis Culin was nervous. This was a 4-star general, the man commanding all American ground forces in France. Bradley had thousands of things to worry about. He was planning Operation Cobra, the massive breakout offensive that was supposed to finally smash through the German lines. And here was Culin, a sergeant, about to show him a device made from scrap metal and welding. Bradley arrived with his staff. He was known for being approachable, more down-to-earth than many generals, but he also had a reputation for being coldly analytical. He wanted results, not showmanship. Culin gave a brief explanation. The problem with going over the hedgerows, the solution of going through them, the design of the prongs, how they'd cut into the base of the earthen walls. Then it was time to show, not tell. Culin's tank, now equipped with the Rhino device, fired up its engine. It rolled toward a thick hedgerow that had been selected for the demonstration. This wasn't a small one. It was one of the big ones, maybe 10 feet tall with a base 6 feet thick, covered in mature trees and brambles, the kind that had been stopping tanks for weeks. The tank picked up speed. The steel prongs, those 4 massive tusks, were pointed right at the base of the hedgerow, like spears aimed at a target. The tank hit the hedgerow at full speed. There was a tremendous crash. The ground shook, and then the hedgerow just disintegrated. The prongs ripped through the earthen base, tearing up massive clumps of dirt and roots. The trees and bushes on top didn't matter. They came along for the ride, uprooted and shoved aside. The tank plowed through the wall as if it wasn't even there. In less than 5 seconds, the tank burst through into the next field. It hadn't tilted. It hadn't slowed down. It just punched straight through and kept going. Bradley, according to witnesses, watched in stunned silence. And then he smiled. He turned to his staff and said something to the effect of, "I want these on every tank in the First Army. Now." Bradley understood immediately what this meant. It wasn't just a useful gadget. It was a game-changer. With Rhino tanks, his armored divisions could advance through the bocage at speed. They wouldn't have to fight for every hedgerow. They could bypass German defensive positions entirely. The whole character of the battle would change. But there was a problem. Operation Cobra was scheduled to launch in days. How do you equip thousands of tanks with a new device in just a few days? That's where the genius of Culin's design really showed. Because it was so simple, it didn't require precision engineering. It didn't need rare materials. Any maintenance crew with a welding torch could build one, and the raw material was right there on the beaches. Thousands of tons of German steel obstacles just waiting to be repurposed. Bradley gave the order. Every maintenance unit, every tank battalion, every engineer company start building Rhino devices. Cut up the Czech hedgehogs. Weld them to the tanks. Work around the clock. And they did. Across the American sector in Normandy, you suddenly had this incredible scene. Tank crews and mechanics working day and night, cutting steel, welding prongs, bolting them onto Shermans and Stuarts and every other kind of tank they had. The beaches were stripped of German obstacles in days. The steel that Hitler had placed there to stop the invasion was now being turned into the weapon that would break his defensive lines. It was poetic justice. The Germans had no idea this was happening. Bradley made sure of that. He issued strict orders. No Rhino tanks were to be used in combat until Operation Cobra began. He wanted the element of surprise. He wanted the first time the Germans saw these things to be when hundreds of them came smashing through the hedgerows all at once. By the time Operation Cobra launched on July 25, 1944, approximately 60% of the tanks in the First Army had been equipped with Culin's device. That's about 3,000 tanks, all fitted with the Rhino prongs, all ready to turn the hedgerows from death traps into nothing more than speed bumps. Curtis Culin, the sergeant from New Jersey with no engineering degree, had just equipped an entire army with a weapon nobody had thought to build. And when Operation Cobra began, the results were devastating. For the Germans, July 25, 1944. Operation Cobra begins with the largest tactical bombing operation the world has ever seen. Over 2,000 Allied bombers carpet bomb a 5-mile stretch of the German defensive line. It's supposed to pulverize the enemy positions, but it's not quite as effective as hoped. Many German units survive in deep bunkers. The bombing is so intense it actually creates craters and rubble that make advancing harder, not easier. But then the tanks start moving, and everything changes. The Germans are expecting the same slow, grinding advance they've been dealing with for weeks. A few tanks trying to climb over hedgerows, getting picked off by anti-tank teams. Infantry having to clear each field yard by yard. The kind of fighting where a single German platoon can hold up an entire American battalion for hours. Instead, they see something they've never seen before. American tanks, dozens of them, hundreds of them, charging straight through the hedgerows, not climbing over them, not getting stuck on them, just smashing through like the ancient earthen walls don't exist. The German defensive strategy falls apart immediately. See, the Germans had positioned their forces based on predictable crossing points. They knew where tanks could get through the hedgerows. They had those points zeroed in with artillery. They had anti-tank teams waiting at each one. But now the tanks weren't using the crossing points. They were making their own. Everywhere. All at once. A German anti-tank team would set up to cover one gap in the hedgerows, and suddenly a Sherman with steel tusks would burst through the hedgerow 50 yards to their left. By the time they repositioned, 3 more tanks had come through, in 3 other spots. The defensive system that had stalled the Allies for weeks collapsed in hours. The American tanks could finally use their advantages: speed, numbers, firepower. They could maneuver. They could flank. They could do what tanks were designed to do instead of being stuck in narrow lanes like fish in a barrel. The psychological effect was just as important. German soldiers who'd been confident in their defensive positions suddenly found themselves cut off and surrounded. American tanks were appearing behind their lines, beside their lines, everywhere at once. Units that might have fought stubbornly for a position, instead, chose to retreat or surrender rather than be caught in an encirclement. The breakout that Allied planners had hoped would happen over weeks happened in days. American armored divisions punched through the German lines and raced south and east. They captured the city of Avranches, a critical junction point. From there, General George Patton's Third Army poured through the gap and began a hell-for-leather dash across France. The Germans tried to counterattack, but they couldn't stop the momentum. The bocage, which had been their greatest asset, was now irrelevant. American tanks just plowed through it. By mid-August, the Allies had trapped the German 7th Army in the Falaise pocket, destroying dozens of divisions. The German position in France became untenable. Paris was liberated on August 25th. By September, Allied forces were approaching the German border. The war in Europe still had 9 months to go. There would be more hard fighting, more casualties, more desperate battles. But the tide had turned. The Allies had broken out of Normandy, and one of the key reasons they'd done it was because a sergeant from New Jersey had figured out how to turn German beach obstacles into hedgerow cutters. Curtis Culin became a celebrity, at least within the army. His invention was written up in military journals. He was awarded the Legion of Merit, one of the highest decorations for non-combat achievement. News reporters wanted to interview him, and Culin, to his credit, tried to give credit where it was due. He kept mentioning the soldier from Tennessee who'd made the joke about saw teeth. He'd say things like, "It wasn't really my idea, I just made it work." But nobody was interested in that. They wanted a hero, and Culin was it. President Eisenhower would later tell Culin's story in speeches. In January 1961, in one of his last addresses as president, Eisenhower described how a sergeant's crazy idea had changed the course of the invasion, how the army had almost been too cautious to try it, how they'd found the steel from German obstacles, how Bradley had seen it work and ordered it into immediate production. Eisenhower used it as an example of American ingenuity and the importance of listening to ideas from every level, not just the top brass. It became a famous story, taught at military academies as an example of battlefield innovation. But here's what happened to Curtis Culin himself, and it's important. 4 months after his invention helped win the Battle of Normandy, Culin was still in combat. His unit was fighting in Germany in a place called the Hürtgen Forest. It was one of the longest and bloodiest battles the Americans fought in Europe, a nightmare of mines and artillery and winter weather. On a cold day in November 1944, Curtis Culin stepped on a landmine. He survived, but he lost his right leg below the knee. The man who'd saved thousands of American lives with his invention became one more casualty of the war. He was sent back to the United States to recover. He was 29 years old, a hero, and he'd never walk normally again. Curtis Culin came home to Cranford, New Jersey in 1945. He was fitted with a prosthetic leg. He married a woman named Bernice Enright. They moved to New York City, where Culin got a job as a salesman for Schenley Industries, a liquor distributor, and that was his life. Not a general, not a famous engineer, a salesman with a prosthetic leg, living a normal life in New York City. By all accounts, he didn't talk much about the war or his invention. He wasn't the type to brag. He went to work, came home to his family, lived quietly. The kind of man you could pass on the street and never know that he'd changed history. Curtis Culin died in 1963 at the age of 48. Heart attack in Greenwich Village. He was buried in Westfield, New Jersey. His obituary mentioned his Legion of Merit and his invention of the hedgerow cutter. But it was a brief mention among the other details of his life. For a while, it seemed like his story might be forgotten. But it wasn't. Military historians kept coming back to it. Because the Rhino tank is one of the clearest examples of battlefield innovation in World War II. It's taught at West Point and other military academies as a case study. How do you foster innovation in a large organization? How do you respond when the plan isn't working? How do you listen to ideas from unexpected sources? The Culin hedgerow cutter is the answer to all those questions. In 2010, Culin's hometown of Cranford, New Jersey, erected a memorial to him. It's on the corner of North and Springfield Avenues. A stone monument with a plaque describing what he did and why it mattered. There's a small park nearby named in his honor. The National Museum of the United States Army has a Rhino tank on display, one of the few surviving examples. The steel prongs are still attached to the front. You can see exactly what it looked like. This simple but effective device that turned a stalled invasion into a breakout. And every few years, someone rediscovers the story, and it goes viral. A TikTok video, or a YouTube documentary, or a Reddit post. Young people learning for the first time about the sergeant who saved D-Day with a welding torch and some scrap metal. Because it's a great story. It has everything. An impossible problem. An unexpected hero. A moment of inspiration. A dramatic demonstration. And real consequences? Thousands of lives saved. A war shortened. But I want to end with something deeper. Because Culin's story teaches us something important. We live in a world that's obsessed with experts. When there's a problem, we immediately look to the specialists, the people with advanced degrees and decades of experience. And often, that's the right approach. Expertise matters, but sometimes the experts are too close to the problem. They've been thinking about it so long in a certain way that they can't see outside that framework. They're trapped by their own knowledge, and that's when someone like Curtis Culin can come along. Someone who doesn't know enough to know that an idea is supposed to be impossible. Someone who can look at a problem fresh and think, what if we just try this? Culin wasn't smarter than the Army engineers who'd been working on the hedgerow problem. He didn't know more about tank design or fortification breaching. But he had two things they didn't have. First, he was actually there, on the ground, dealing with the problem every day. He knew what it felt like to be stuck behind a hedgerow while Germans were shooting at you. That created urgency and focus that people back at headquarters couldn't match. Second, he was willing to try something that seemed ridiculous. Saw teeth to cut through hedgerows? The first reaction was laughter. But Culin thought, why not? What's the worst that could happen? We're already stuck. Might as well try. That combination of ground-level experience and willingness to try the unconventional, that's where innovation comes from. It's not just a World War II story. It's relevant today. How many problems are we stuck on because we're only listening to the experts? How many solutions are we missing because the people closest to the problem don't think they're qualified to suggest ideas? The story of Curtis Culin is a reminder that good ideas can come from anywhere. That the hierarchy of expertise isn't always the hierarchy of solutions. That sometimes you need to let the sergeant with the welding torch try his crazy idea. Because you never know when it might just save everything. Curtis Culin turned a broken tank defense into a bridge-smashing ram. More specifically, he turned German steel obstacles into American hedgerow cutters. He took the enemy's defensive positions and made them irrelevant. He saved Operation Cobra. He shortened the war in Europe. He saved thousands of American lives. And he did it all with scrap metal, a welding torch, and the willingness to listen to a joke and think, wait a minute, what if that could actually work? That's the power of not knowing you're supposed to fail. That's the power of trying anyway. That's the power of one person with a good idea and the courage to test it. Curtis Grubb, Culin III. Sergeant, United States Army. The mad mechanic who changed history. remember his name.